Welcome to Introduction to ArrayLists. In this lecture, we'll be understanding what an ArrayList is, we'll be comparing an ArrayList with an array, and then we'll be looking at how we declare ArrayLists. And then to finish all of this off, we'll be moving to the Dr. Java IDE to get a quick example of how we can declare an ArrayList in a live programming environment. So let's start off by understanding what an array list is, because this entire section is all about array lists. So an array list is a way of storing a list of objects. And an important thing to keep in mind here is that the only thing an array list can store is objects. So it can store a list of objects, different things like a list of strings or a list of anything that is an object. It cannot store a list of primitive types. So it cannot store a list of doubles or something like that. And this ArrayList class is part of the Collections API. So remember that API stands for Application Programming Interface, and that this ArrayList class is part of the Collections API or library. And in order to use this ArrayList in our programs, we're going to have to import it. And that's something that as we move to Dr. Java, we'll be taking a look at. So we're going to have to use the import statement in order to use an ArrayList in our program. And when you hear a way of storing a list, this should ring a bell because this is exactly like an array. And although the two are very similar, there are also many differences. And now let's move on to understand those. So an array list versus an array. So the great thing about an array list, and probably the most important thing about an array list, is that it has a flexible length. And basically what that means is when you use arrays, we see that, there's a fixed number of elements in an array, let's say 6 or 5. It's a fixed number, it's not going to get changed in the program. But the great thing about an array list is you can easily change the number of elements or the length of the array list. And that's what makes it much easier to use in programs because it's so flexible. And in programs where you don't know how many elements you're going to have in a list, that's where you use an array list because the array list is flexible to change. And when you know exactly how many elements you're going to have in an array, that's when you use an array. So another great thing about it is that you can insert and delete elements from anywhere in the array list, whether it's the beginning, end, or right in the middle. And it basically auto shifts. So what that means is that let's say I have an array list of 6 elements and I insert an element in the third spot. So now what happens when I insert it in the third spot is that all of the elements after the third spot will have their index increased by 1 and will move to the right to make way for this element that's being inserted. And we'll understand how we can insert and delete elements into an array list when we look at the methods of the array list. So now the last slide is declaring array lists. And basically what this is we know that we understood what array lists are. Now the only thing that's left is to understand how we can add them into our programs. And the following is the declaration for an array list. So array list type name equals new array list type parentheses semicolon. So basically type will be replaced by whatever object type that the array list will contain. Name will be replaced by whatever you would like to name your array list. And then the second type will also be the same as the first type in whatever object type your elements are. That's what it should be. And then the new keyword is used as we've seen many times when we're creating an object of a class, because basically the array list is a class and we're creating an object out of it every time we declare it. So now let's look at a couple examples and understand that. So the array list let's look at an example. So array list int wrong equals new array list int. And the problem with this is that our type is int. And as I said earlier in the lecture, an array list cannot be of type int, or it cannot be of type primitive type. It must be of object type. And that's why this declaration is incorrect and will cause an error, because an array list can only be an object, and if it's a primitive type, that's going to be a problem. Now let's look at another example which is correct. Array list card correct equals new array list card. So card is basically some class or object that we've already defined and we've already worked with. But the important thing to note is that it is an object. So that's why this will work. And earlier in the course we took a look at boxing, or basically looked at the wrapper classes where we were converting the int primitive type to the integer object type and doing things like that. And you may have wondered, what is the use of this? Well, this is an example of one of the uses. There's often a time where you get you have int variables of primitive types, and you need to use them in array lists. That's where you're going to have to convert the int primitive type to the integer object type. And that's one of the ways where the wrapper classes are really useful, because in situations like the array list where you can only use objects, that's where you really need to convert a primitive type to an object. So now, without further ado, let's move to Dr. Java and take a look at a quick example of how we can declare array lists. So here we are in Dr. Java. I have a file set up and it's called ArrayList_test.java. And what we're going to be doing in this program is simply declaring an array list of named x, and it's going to contain integer objects. That's it. We're not going to be adding anything to it, removing it, or anything like that. We're just going to be declaring it and make sure we understand what it is. So the first thing that's important to take a look at is this line right over here that's highlighted. And the important reason that we need to take a look at that is because it's the import statement. And earlier in the lecture I mentioned how we need an import statement in order to use an array list. So here's the import statement. Import java.util.ArrayList semicolon. So this is importing the ArrayList class so that we can use it in our program. So now I've declared the class, I've declared the main method, and now within the main method I'm just going to type one line. That's all for this program, where we're going to be declaring an array list. So let's go ArrayList, and then within these arrows we're going to say integer, so we know that it's of type integer. Let's call it x equals, now notice how I use the new keyword, new, and then I go ArrayList, repeating what we said earlier, ArrayList, and we have to keep the type integer because that's what we said earlier in this line, ArrayList, and then last thing is these parentheses. And with that, now what we've done is we have created an array list named x, which contains elements that are integers, and there's no defined length of this array list or no defined size. It's subject to change and depending on whatever you want to do, so it's very, very flexible. And now all we have to do is compile to make sure it works. So as you can see, the compile was completed, and if you run it, we're not going to get any output, but all we know is that everything is working fine and the computer completely has understood what that we wanted to declare an array list. So in this lecture we took a look at an array list, which is an alternative to an array because it's a more flexible length and it's easier to insert and delete elements. The only drawback is that it's only limited to objects and you cannot have primitive types as elements. And we looked at declaring arrays, and soon we'll be taking a look at the different methods you can use with these array lists.